Hello, AP World History. You have the privilege of getting to listen to my disembodied talking head that is hanging out here in the ether of the universe. And from this position, I am going to talk with you about the emergence of China as a civilization. So, first and foremost, remember that I'm going to skip around a great deal because this is period zero. This is really just context, but this is context that you will actually really need to pay attention to. This might be a little redundant since we are talking about ancient world history, but pretty much everything about China is, well, ancient. Most ancient European states trace their emergence somewhere during the Middle Ages. So the Kingdom of England is forged supposedly by King Alfred the Great, I think in the 900s or so. The Kingdom of France emerges shortly after the fall of the Roman Empire in 476. These are young and spry countries, anywhere from 1500 to a little over 1,000 years old. China, however, goes all the way back, depending upon if you're counting semi-mythical dynasties or historically verified dynasties, anywhere from roughly 2,000 years before the Common Era to possibly back even further. China has had a variety of different types of governments, but for the most part, they've all been either incredibly centralized or incredibly decentralized. Most of the time, they're incredibly centralized. And what we mean by that is that these are states with powerful central governments and bureaucracies that have almost total power and control over lower level provinces and states. This desire for centralization is something that you can see all the way back in the Qin dynasty under Qi Shi Huangdi. It's also something that you can see, let's be controversial and say, during the Tiananmen Square massacre, where the Chinese state felt that they had to put down pro-liberal, sort of pro-democratic reform movements, or else they would lose their hold on power. Yeah, China is a little uptight about that. One of the reasons that Chinese governments have always been a little touchy over threats to centralization is because of a casual reading of pretty much any period of Chinese history from the beginning of ever to now. Some of the bloodiest wars in history, I kid you not, are wars that are fought almost entirely inside of China when the state system basically falls apart. We'll actually go over some of them. And if you actually go on Wikipedia and look at the wars ranked by fatalities, I think that the Taiping Rebellion is just right under the Second World War in terms of total fatalities. And that's just a war that takes place within China itself. So, the way it works is that when a government, whether it's an imperial dynasty, whether it's a republic in the early 20th century, or whether it's the modern Communist Party starting from 1949 to the present, whenever they come to power, they are given this thing called the Mandate of Heaven by the Chinese people. This is basically the unwritten rule or contract that says that the state will basically be able to do most anything that it wants to do so long as it does a reasonable job of it. Another way to think of it is like Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. So the state is given almost omnipotent levels of power to basically do whatever it wants. If the state wants to conscript hundreds of thousands of Chinese peasants to build a wall to basically expel the Mongolians or the Huns or whatever barbarian horse archer people we're trying to defend ourselves against, well, by golly, the emperor gets what the emperor wants. But they have to do a credible job. So the Mandate of Heaven means that the state is responsible for everything. Everything that is bad or good that happens within the Chinese state is the state's responsibility. Everything that is bad is also the state's responsibility. So think about this. The Chinese state is sort of responsible for almost every cat being stuck up in a tree. Now, all societies have what we would call social contracts with the state, where in return for giving the state taxes, military service, support, etc., we expect the state to give something back. The degree to which we see that in the mandate of heaven idea, where the Chinese are supposed to religiously follow the emperor and believe that the emperor represents the will of heaven, is kind of an extreme form of that social contract. The idea is that you should provide the emperor your unconditional support or loyalty until such time that the emperor really seems to screw things up. So let me introduce another vocabulary word that I think is going to help things a little bit. So there's this idea of legitimacy. Legitimacy is a measurement that political scientists use to determine the extent to which the people perceive that the state has the right to rule. So the mandate of heaven idea is based on the idea that the heavens have given the emperor the right to rule. We also have to talk about what heaven is. We're not talking about the pearly white great gates with St. Peter having the big checklist and saying, okay, out, in, out, in. That's not what heaven means. Heaven is almost the universal will or expression of how the universe ought to be. It is the idea of the universe itself sort of having a will or consciousness, but there's also not this idea that heaven itself is a person or a sentient being. It is probably the best way to sort of think of it, to be honest, is like the Force in Star Wars. It's an impersonal, all-powerful energy field that has a will of its own. Chinese dynasties are able to establish legitimacy when they create peace, when they offer protection from barbarians on the fringes of the empire. They build infrastructure. The economy thrives when art and culture are also sort of blooming. But the thing is that nothing lasts forever, and this includes dynasties. So eventually, these dynasties become plagued by a series of problems. Maybe it's corruption. Maybe it's a decline in imperial administration because these emperors were very dependent upon a very loyal and highly educated class of scholar courtiers or scholar sort of aristocrats. And so sometimes they were very reliable, sometimes less so. When this starts to fragment, what you start to see is you see people at the local level being more willing to challenge the authority of the state. And when that happens, legitimacy breaks down. This creates a series of periods in Chinese history that we'll just kind of broadly call warring states periods. The most recent one was, of course, during the Chinese Civil War, which basically rages between, we'll gloss over a lot of historical detail and say from 1911 until 1949. But believe it or not, this is just one of many periods in Chinese history where the state basically collapses because of challenges to its rule. And the state has to basically establish a new dynasty or a new regime to pick up the pieces. So let's dive into some of these early dynasties. We're not going to spend a ton of time on any particular one. The first dynasty that we have is the Jia dynasty, which we don't actually have any independent archaeological records of whatsoever. It emerges out of what we call the Honghe civilization. That basically just means Yellow River civilization. And here we got the boundaries of what that civilization is. Like we said, Indian civilization actually expands far beyond the borders of India. Chinese civilization begins pretty small and still stays mostly compacted along the east coast of China right here, even today to an extent. The Honghe civilization develops pretty early. It cultivates rice around 7,000 or so BCE. And throughout Chinese history, China has been on the forefront of advances technologically, especially in the area of agriculture. And so China itself becomes extremely self-sufficient. I know that agrarian societies are supposed to be self-sufficient almost by definition, but China is an extreme outlier here. And so for a variety of different reasons, China develops this view that some people argue that it still has today, where it views itself as the middle kingdom of the world, or Zhonghuo. There are a number of empires that sort of believe in the idea of universal expansion. The Assyrian Empire and the Roman Empire, they were both empires that basically believed that their borders should stretch as far as they could. In fact, that kind of becomes part of the Assyrian and the Roman brand, right? Continuous expansion. China expands, but China has periods in its history where it sort of concludes that the rest of the world is pretty much rubbish, has nothing of value to offer it, and then isolates itself from what it perceives to be barbarian outsiders. And you know what, to a certain extent, you can't entirely fault them for that mentality. China and its economy was so incredibly self-sufficient that outside of a few strategic resources, even as far back as the Shang Dynasty, it's hard to find instances of things from the outside that China genuinely wants or needs. So what we generally find is that China has periods where it practices an isolationist foreign policy. And what it will often do is it will, when it expands outward, it's really trying to subdue other states so that they declare homage to the emperor. The idea is that they create vassal states. A vassal state is a state that basically surrenders part of its sovereignty to some other country, usually a larger, more powerful country. And a huge number of countries throughout East Asia have histories of being vassal states of China's empire. And this is something that we start to see begin in the Shang Dynasty, but you're going to see it much more pronounced going forward. After the Shang Dynasty, a leader by the name of Wu Wang basically displaces them and establishes the Zhou Dynasty, almost pronounced Joe, by the way, but not actually Joe, disappointingly. So why does Zhou get to overthrow the Shang Dynasty? Well, he is the one who actually creates the idea of the mandate of heaven. Basically, if you said that the universe told me that I could do it, well, that's a fairly powerful argument, as long as you find that convincing. So over the next 600 or so years, you see this Chinese state under the Zhou dynasty expand. Then you get a sort of a decline in the mandate of heaven, and this leads to the era of the warring states. The first significant one that we'll talk about. So this is partially because of the weakness of feudalism, and of course, the icing on the cake is a bunch of nomadic invasions coming in from all corners. So the era of the warring states, look how long this lasts. Even though China has had already thousands of years having centralized government, this period of time lasts for about 200 years. So these periods of state disruption can last a really long time. So then we get the Qin dynasty, led by their first and most important emperor, Qixin Huangdi, who basically says, yeah, enough of that, and curbs feudalism and makes sure that the Chinese state is incredibly centralized from this point forward. Qixin Huangdi's philosophy seems to have been legalism, which basically means that, well, the TLDR is that if you turn in your assignment at 12 a.m. instead of 11:59, you get a 0 because those are the rules. You get a sense that maybe Qixin Huangdi was trying to respond pretty harshly to this 200-year period of China not really having a central government whatsoever. Now, in most feudal societies, you have this sort of warrior class near the top. What Qixin Huangdi tries to do is he kind of undermines those warriors, those aristocratic elites, and he increasingly depends upon a number of personally selected non-aristocratic officials that are selected more through competence than by military, or for more than for military prowess. Now, if you remember, not only did you have lots of threats coming from the inside through the form of feudal aristocrats, leading ultimately to the disruption and destruction of the Zhou dynasty, you also had raiders, nomads coming in from the fringes of China's empire and basically helping to accelerate that state collapse. So Qishan Huangdi decided to basically just expel all the barbarians by building a gigantic wall that you can see from orbit to this day called the Great Wall of China. It is the largest construction project in human history, and it's built by forced or conscripted labor. So Qishan Huangdi, I'm going to be crude and basically call him the Joseph Stalin of Chinese history. So both leaders were known as being incredibly cruel and incredibly brutal. Both leaders adopt incredibly cruel and brutal tactics because of problems they see within their societies. Though, admittedly, Joseph Stalin at least had the excuse that he was fighting Hitler. Qishan Huangdi had the excuse that he was fighting the potential chaos that would engulf the state if his reforms were not accurately and effectively carried out. So, this next thing is pretty big. Those scholar nobles, eventually those Confucian bureaucrats that have always been sort of the backbone of China's ruling elite, they kind of become institutionalized during the period of the Han Dynasty. Now, note the name Han Dynasty. It is both the name of the dynasty, but it also reflects the dominant ethnicity within China even to this day, where the vast majority of people within the People's Republic of China identify themselves as being Han Chinese. So the Han maintained the very centralized government from the Qin dynasty. They also established a merit-based examination system to select civil servants to work for the government. And remember, these civil servants are incredibly powerful. So these civil servants are required to have training in Confucianism, and this creates that class of scholar bureaucrats. Now, to what extent these exams are meritocratic, historians can sort of debate. But the fact that some meritocracy was being adopted here at all is historically noteworthy. So if you notice, Han China is much larger than Qin China. It's expanding quite rapidly. It's even expanding beyond the borders of where China is today into parts of Southeast Asia. So you see the increase of trade, and remember that with the increase of trade, you basically get the increase of everything else. Wealth, diseases, and of course the exchange of new religions. First and foremost, this is kind of mind-boggling to think about. Han China actually had trade relations not only with India and what was the Persian Empire of the time, the Parthian Empire, but it also had trade relations with the Roman Empire. Now, the Romans didn't really seem to have anything that the Chinese wanted. The opposite, by the way, was not necessarily true, but the Romans and the Chinese had trade relations during this time period. This is what we consider to be the beginning of the Silk Roads, this trade route that is frequently used between East and West, where Chinese luxury goods are highly sought after, especially in areas of Western Europe, but also just any place that is not China, because the Chinese had such a huge early start over their competitors. So this is also the time period where Buddhism begins to spread into China. And Buddhism and its impact on the Confucian aristocratic elite in China is pretty tumultuous. Confucianism is basically the philosophy of you need to follow the state and you need to follow your elders, period. Buddhism is, the philosophy of you do you. You have an eightfold path, you have suffering, why don't you get rid of that and you'll be happy. These are two incredibly different philosophies, and it's almost inevitable that they're going to come into some kind of conflict. But this is also when you start to see the decline of the Han Dynasty. You have invasions by the Huns. Interestingly, something else the Romans and the Han Dynasty share in common, a mutual hatred or dislike of the Huns. And so you see the collapse of the Han because of these invasions. You also see the emergence of, I think, an extremist Taoist cult called the Yellow Turban Rebellion. What happens is that the Han Dynasty is not able to effectively suppress the Yellow Turban Rebellion, and the dynasty is forced to depend upon help from warlords and military aristocrats. Oh, and wouldn't you know, this also is right before a nearly 300-year period of civil war in China, called the Three Kingdoms period. Now, this period of Chinese history is actually one of my favorite because it gives us the work called Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which is, I guess, a romance if people getting stabbed in the face is your definition of romance. It's basically China's version of the Trojan War. If you haven't heard of it, you can also download one of 15 million Dynasty Warriors games that are out on the gaming system of your choice and basically get the overall idea of what the conflict's about. But it lasts a very, very long time, obviously. So this kind of gives us an idea of the expansion of the Chinese state that's happened over the last several thousand years. Now let's kind of turn attention to those ideologies and religious beliefs that form so much of the foundation for the Chinese state. Let's start with the big one, Confucius. Also, his real name is Kongfuzi, but fortunately it's been simplified to the more pronounceable Confucius. So for a philosophy or religion to have staying power, it has to correctly, or at least attempt, to provide solutions to problems. So if there's a problem, for example, of where people are worried about what's going to happen in the next life, is there the potential for an afterlife for people who maybe don't have a lot of money? Well, Christianity comes about, and of course Christianity believes that all may have salvation in God, regardless of how rich they are, regardless of whether or not they have sinned. So whatever your belief is or isn't here, the fact is that Christianity does provide some very specific solutions to very specific problems. So what is a very specific problem in China? Well, the fact that you have periods of hundreds of years of civil wars and basically anarchy, local rule, warlord rule, where the world kind of every now and then becomes the world of Mad Max or Fallout. So Kongfuzi, or Confucius, basically makes a philosophy which revolves around everybody understanding what their proper role is in society. It's a very social philosophy. It's not really all that interested in sort of exploring the deepest recesses of the soul. It's very narrowly focused on your relationship with not only other people, but with the state itself. And the idea is that everything is paternalistic. So the idea is that a son should show proper deference to a father. Similarly, a father of a leader of a household should show proper deference to the emperor. And the emperor needs to show deference to the will of heaven. So everything has some kind of relationship. And Confucius says that your ability, your worth is based upon your ability to know what that place is and to basically, know your place. Also note the use of the gendered, father and son. This is a very let's say, anti-feminist political social philosophy. Confucianism generally did not hold much esteem for women. Now, you notice that Confucius is also alive and spreading his beliefs around the same time as Buddha, interestingly. Let's go on to legalism. Legalism is even more statist, and not only does it believe that individuals should show appropriate deference to authority, it believes that human nature is evil and requires constant discipline, and that a person's ultimate responsibility is to serve the state. As you can kind of imagine, it's probably not going to be all that successful because, well, what's in it for individuals? Like, what do they get out of it? I suppose an absence of chaos, but we also know that the Qin and Han dynasties also eventually collapse into some form of chaos. Finally, we have an actual philosophy slash religion, depending upon what your assumptions are, that actually explores problems of the individual. And remember, Buddhism and legalism don't, sorry, Confucianism and legalism don't really explore those types of problems. They're both very focused on the state itself. So Lao Tzu is an individual who believes that the problem in Chinese society is that people are living out of the will of nature. This is the guy that comes up with the idea of yin and yang, and the idea that everything should be in proper balance. And so that's probably a good place to stop since first period is now coming in. First period, say hi to fourth period.
Hi, fourth period.
Okay, fourth period, you will see me or see this a little bit later.